On January 30th, 1649, on a very cold day, King Charles I, king of all the kingdoms, became the only monarch executed in this country's history, certainly on the orders of Parliament. The ins and whys are fairly complex. I've read many books in the past year about the Civil War, the causes for it, the aftermath and everything, but honestly, you can't really summarise it in a short video, which this is going to try and be. For all his faults, the king went to his death bravely, on a scaffolding in front of what we now call Banqueting House. And they say that the executioner did or didn't do what they usually did when they executed somebody on the charge of high treason, and that is shout, "Behold the head of a traitor." Either way, when the head was held aloft, it is said that the crowd watching, who had been rather noisy until then, went deathly silent as if they realised the immensity of what they just did. And then we got our king back 11 years later, his son. But during the trial in Westminster Hall, which we still have, because it's been there since 1097, and I think it's more or less the same inside as in, apart from the roof, which was wiped out by an incendiary on the last night of the Blitz. Those 3 days in 1649 must have been the most momentous moments in this country's history until the Battle of Britain, maybe, who knows. Until then, 1649, monarchs were not allowed technically into the House of Commons without at least prior permission. I mean, they were in there. I mean, I believe James I was in there once, and that was the king's father, who almost got blown up in 1605 at Parliament, of course. But the Commons was sovereignty, and a lot of things were culminated in the civil wars of 1642 to 1649, but amongst them was the fact that the king really wasn't showing Parliament respect, trying to get money out of them and the rest of it. My town's local hero, John Hampden, who has half of this town named after him and a statue in the town centre, was one of those that stood against the king when he was trying to bring in ship money, and was like, well, what's the point charging Aylesbury with ship money? We're hundreds odd miles away from the coast. We haven't got any ships. And this was before the Grand Union Canal came in. So if the king had been the canal had been there, the king I'd think would turn around and go, "Well, you've got a canal, so I'll charge you for that." But no. At some point in 1642, the king came to arrest members of Parliament, including John Hampden, and they had left. So the king had sat down in the Speaker's chair, which meant that he had power in Parliament, because the Speaker used to have the power. And indeed, prior to that, the Speaker had been sat on by members of Parliament so that Parliament wouldn't close and was kept in session. He was in floods of tears. The king was sending people there, like we have Black Rod now, who bangs on the door and says, "Let us in." The the monarch wants to speak to you. In the old days, so you could never, you could get away with feasibly saying, "Well, no, we're not going to come out." And all of what happens with the state opening of Parliament stems from Charles I. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, maybe. The king sits down and says, "Where are these 5 members of Parliament?" And the Speaker more or less said, "I have neither eyes to see with, nor lips to speak with. I cannot reveal their location," kind of thing. So the king said the birds had flown, and he left. And next thing you know, in the next few weeks and months, he raised an army, Parliament had an army, and we had a very bloody civil war where family members were turned upon one another. Now, as far as military campaigns go, the civil war on the king's side was not the most well-run or organised of offence. He had generals and the like, and one of the most dedicated was his nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, played fantastically flamboyantly by Timothy Dalton in the film Cromwell in 1970, but it was a bit of a mess, to put it mildly, and the ins and outs, as I say, are complicated, but the battles of Naseby, Marston and decided this country's history, and yet, as far as battlefields go in the world, they're not preserved as such. Even Bosworth Field, where a century and a half before the king, the Civil War, isn't really preserved as such, and yet that's where Richard III was killed, and Henry Tudor took the throne from him and started off the Tudor dynasty. Hence why Richard III was found a couple of years ago under what is now a municipal car park. So Naseby and Marston Moor are still there, but no one knows they're there but for a few small signs by all accounts. Civil wars come and go, the king's imprisoned, and there was a second civil war when he escaped, and then he eventually ended up on the Isle of Wight thinking it was a safe harbour, and the governor turned on him and then imprisoned him, and when he was released from Hurst Castle, it was to London. He was placed on trial. Now, again, the ins and outs of the trial are rather complicated, but the king was essentially placed on a chair facing a fantastically hostile parliament. One of the MPs spat in his face, and when the king dropped his stick once, he expected somebody to rush over and pick it up, and nobody did. And I'd imagine if I was Charles, I'd think to myself, well, it looks like the tables have turned as far as Parliament goes. So, at some point, apparently, during the trial, he must have been led out for like a lunch break or something. And either way, he was being led out, and the guards were with him, of course. And in those days, the public could get right up close to the parliamentarians, so to speak. And some of them were still, a lot of people were still loyal to the king. It wasn't a blanket republicanism that descended, and some people were shouting, "God save the king, God save the king," when such words carried weight. Nowadays, if I shouted "God save the queen" out the window, after her speech, I'd be locked up for noise pollution. Apparently the guards were slightly irked at this outpouring, and they shouted, "Justice, justice, justice." And that's the thing, this trial was the combination, really, of centuries' worth of building aggression, in terms of words at any rate, on either side. The king increasingly was consumed by his powers. The kings believed up until Charles, really, that they were sent by God, hence the divine right of kings. Charles literally believed he was sent by God to rule over the English people. At the same time, the monarchs were needing Parliament for money and all this stuff. Charles II was. I think that kind of thing probably died out in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And so what happened in 1649 was the net result. In the medieval period, Henry II was told by Parliament, "You better sort your act out or we'll sort it out for you." And apparently he left Westminster Hall shaking. So parliamentary sovereignty stems from that day. And Charles was led, as I ultimately told, he'd be charged on a charge of high treason. And in those days, that was a crime against the sovereign. And apparently Charles said, with good reason, I think, "I'm not a lawyer, but how can I commit a crime against myself? That is what treason is." And they were like, "Don't be clever." Cromwell ends up taking over the country. He removed Parliament around about 1652, telling them they'd outlived their usefulness, "the love of God go," which was words quoted by Leo Emery to Nathan Chamberlain during the Norway debate of 1940. And we executed a king. I find it incredible. No one seemed to care or be awestruck by it on tour buses until I had my first walking tour, which had one chap in attendance, and he was utterly fascinated by the English history. And we were at Horse Guards, and I said, "Whilst we're here, that building over there is where we executed the king." And he went, "Wow, I've read about Charles I. I didn't think I'd be seeing it." From Charles's death, things have changed. The Queen, it took a couple of centuries. It wasn't an instant change, but Her Majesty Elizabeth II does not have any power, really. They were saying during the Brexit fracas last year that the Queen should step in. Enough is enough. It's been 3 years almost, so let's sort it out. The Queen can't as much as she wants to. She can't remove prime ministers. She can't lead her troops into battle. The last one, I think, was George I. She can't do anything, really. It's a case, as I say on the buses, of ticking the boxes. And she's a great woman, don't get me wrong, but compared to Charles I, she's an impotent monarch, really. And Charles, when he becomes king, will be as well. And it'll be interesting if he does change his name to George. And that's what monarchs do. Charles told one of his children, I forget now, it wasn't Charles Stuart, the Prince of Wales, but he said, look after yourself and your mother, because Parliament now is going to sort you all out. This was a child of about 6, and he was about to lose his father, and he had been told by said father that effectively, after I lose my head, you too could lose your head. So the king went bravely to his death. And Cromwell, the movie, has many historical inaccuracies, but that scene is well done. And he had a Scottish accent all the way till death. He was born in Edinburgh and died spent most of his life in England, but always had a Scottish accent. And I only read recently that he actually had a mistress. So I always thought he was rather loyal to Henrietta Maria, like how George III was with Caroline, but apparently he locked up at Hurst Castle. He needed certain needs, and his wife was, I think, either in France or somewhere in London, and I forget the lady's name now, but she was quite famous in the day as his mistress. So there's that. Anyway, nowadays, as I say, when the monarch comes to open Parliament, Black Rod, who for the first time in 400 years of its existence, or longer than 400 years as a lady, effectively has to go to the House of Commons. Now, the Commoners, I believe, stay in their chamber, and the Queen can only go to some kind of chamber near the Lord. She enters through the Victoria Tower, otherwise known as the Sovereign's entrance, and Black Rod the doors are shut in Black Rod's face. Well, before she gets there, she bangs on the door, says something like, your monarch needs you for a speech. Now, as I say, in the old days, they could realistically keep the door shut and go fuck off. But they don't now. I mean, Dennis Skinner, who lost his seat for the first time in 40 years in the last election, he always made some kind of remark which wound up Jacob Rees-Mogg. But now the doors are opened and they shuffle off to the chamber, and the monarch is not allowed into it, as I say, into the Commons. Now, since Charles I, though, we have actually had one monarch who has been in the Commons chamber, and that was the Queen's father, George VI. The Commons chamber was destroyed on the last night of Blitz, 11th of May 1941. It was not even a century old, because it was rebuilt after the 1834 fire, and there's a picture of Churchill standing in the ruins with his head bowed, and I wouldn't be surprised if he had tears running down his cheeks. It took until 1950 to rebuild and repair. They essentially used materials that the Commonwealth, as it was then already called, supplied. And George VI, God bless him, was invited into the Commons chamber to reopen it. And that is the last and only time since Charles I we've had a monarch to do so. Now, Parliament at the moment is a mess of scaffolding. The clock tower is meant to be done next year. Coronavirus might back it up a little, because I can't imagine there's anyone working at the moment. But also, they were saying in the newspapers in January, it might be delayed anyway, because there's a lot more wrong with it than they realise. However, the parliamentary buildings themselves, be it the Commons and the Lords and below ground and but on the roof and everywhere else, will be worked on until at least 2040. And the parliamentarians will have to move out soon in the next couple of years to a new temporary location. I think it'll be awfully interesting to see when it's done, whether or not somebody remembers their history, and by that point it'll be 90 years after the king did it, will the king, and it will be a king in 2040 sadly, will the king be invited by the parliament of the day to open the new Commons chamber and the rest of it. I mean, I imagine the king will be there anyway, and it's going to be, I'd imagine it'll be William by that point. I don't want to put the mockers on Charles, but he'll be 81 when he becomes monarch if the Queen lives as long as her mother, who was almost 102 when she died. And even if Charles lives another 19 years after that, you're looking at, well, I don't know, it could be Charles actually. My maths is that bad. I realise he'll be 100 in 2048, so Christ. Will we be out of lockdown by then? That's the question. So, yeah, keep your eyes peeled, and that was a longer video than I intended, but the Civil War fascinates me, and the death of the King, ever since I was little when I had my children's history of England. Yeah. So, remember, Charles I. Never mind the bonfire. If you want, by the way, before I go, if you want any good books on it, Charles Spencer, the brother of the late Princess Diana, wrote two. One's called To Catch a King. The first one is To Kill a King, which is about the trial and execution of Charles I, and then you got To Catch a King, which is about Charles, Prince of Wales, his exile, and up to when he became Charles II. And there's books on the Civil War that you can read out. Otherwise, check out Penguin Monarchs. There are books no more than 100 pages long. Now, a nice little thing if you don't want to spend time flicking through a 600-page novel. or book, and there's one for each monarch, all the way from, I think it's Ethelred in the pre-Norman conquest days, all the way through to Elizabeth II. They've even done one for Cromwell. So check it out if you can. You see my penguin monarchs in one of my tour guide intro photos. So, yeah, take care.